Well, hello, guys. What a beautiful day. I woke up to paradise this morning. Well, it started last night. It started snowing, and man, we had over 6 inches of snow. There's still snow all over the ground. It was beautiful. I can't believe that it was so heavy, it was breaking the branches on my trees. But, friends, today, I want to do part 2 in the series that we started yesterday. And if you like that video we did yesterday, you'll very likely really like this one. We're going to get to some information, not just the history, but the whys and the wherefores. It's really going to be enlightening. I want to talk about a little about the heroes of old and some of the stories and the divine births and the various prophets and Christs that may have come along and the stories that accompanied them. We find this birth story, not just with Jesus, right? How he's born in a manger and so forth. We find the same kind of a birth story with Samson, with Samuel, with John the Baptist. So whenever you get a birth story, and it was a sign when you were born and stuff like this, and you received the Holy Spirit from birth, why then you're actually very important. You're a very important person. And so we have some who have seen some of these stories that the Greeks tell, which also have sort of divine birth stories. Well, those stories, friends, are the key to everything. That's the story we have in the stars. Now, let me tell you to start about a specific story, a birth story. Some have said that it was the most amazing birth story ever told. This birth story was the herald of the coming of a child who was praised to be the son of Zeus, the savior of the world, which means the son of Theos, or as translated, son of God. Soter, as all the Ptolemies were, who was said to be the personification of peace, love, and truth on earth, the incarnation of the divine. He was fully divine and fully human. But not everybody agrees this was the most amazing birth story ever told, for there were many. And how could that be? Because from time to time, Father Zeus would look down upon men and hear their cries, and would come into a young virgin woman and produce a child that could strengthen the world and give the world morals and hope and bring an alignment of earth with heaven. And this was just one such time, perhaps one of the greatest time, at least in modern reckoning. Alexander the Great. His birth story, it's truly one of the greatest. He was the son of the queen and a deity and the son of a king. Well, his mother was Olympus, and she was a queen. She was married to Philip of Macedonia. But the night before they were married, Queen Olympias dreamed that a thunderbolt fell upon her body, which kindled a great fire, whose divided flames dispersed themselves all around her. And it was like magic. They were just all extinguished at once. And Philip dreamed that he sealed up his queen's little private area with a seal, and it bore the impression of a lion. So the high priests who interpreted the dream, they were a bit concerned, and they warned Philip not to go ahead with the idea of consummating this marriage. Because, you see, no one would go to the trouble of sealing up something that was empty. So it was said that somehow that womb was already full and that child was already there by means of the divine. So you see, Queen Olympias must already be with child, who would undoubtedly be a boy, a son of the deity, and he would have the courage of a lion. And, next to his queen, he found a serpent lying beside her as she slept. And the serpent seemed to be in a position which appeared that it had just had sex. So they went to the oracle of Apollo that was at Delphi, and the oracle said that that was not an ordinary serpent, but it was the incarnation of Zeus. But get this, the day that Alexander the Great was born, one of the 7 wonders of the world burnt to the ground. It was in Ephesus, and it was the home of the goddess Artemis, who was said to have been attending to the birth of Alexander at the time. So Alexander the Great was heralded as the son of Zeus, the savior of the world, and as one of the greatest warriors that the world has ever known. He went on to conquer a good portion of the entire world with his armies and his exploits. But I want to share with you another story about a divine being who was born on earth that was even greater than this one, if you could imagine that. But you see, by the time the hero that we're going to talk about was born, it was hundreds of years later, and the Greeks had no longer ruled the world, and this empire of Rome had somehow now replaced the Greeks. It seems like every time we have a great empire, the birth of that empire is something that happens because of the divine will. And they could always see what the divine will was. The astrologers would look into the sky. So Julius Caesar had established the empire, the likes of which the world had never seen before. The Roman Empire. From the whole world over, it was reigning. His name was Gaius Julius Prowess of the battlefield. You notice that these names, and historians never tell you these things because they don't know. Well, how could they tell you if they don't know? They're guessing about most of everything that they're telling you. But in fact, the titles that grand, important heroes and kings held were quite simple, really. His name was Julius Gaius Caesar. Well, no, that's not some technical theocratic name, some name of the gods. Caesar is the name of one of the deities, he was just like Cleopatra was named Isis and Venus and Aphrodite because she was to be the reincarnation of that ancient divine being. So Caesar was a name after the Egyptian deity Osiris. See, so Caesar is Osiris. The eos at the end is the Greek syntax. You'll remember a man that reigned over Babylon, which was the world empire, whose name was Nebuchadnezzar. in the Bible. Well, Nebo was a deity, and Czar at the end was that spelling at the time of Caesar or Osiris. And so too the Persians had a Messiah. Isaiah says, Cyrus, you are my anointed one. Cyrus is the Persian way of spelling this Caesar, Cyrus, Osiris name. So perhaps he had been incarnated many times before and was just coming to incarnate into this family to make sure that we were all right, as he was often to do. So he was the Osiris. He was the incarnation of Osiris, but his title was Julius Gaius. Julius means youthful, and Gaius means gay, although not the word that we have in our English language today. He wasn't a homosexual, but he was literally gay and rejoicing. Gaius means to be glad and to rejoice. So he was a youthful, joyous, glad person. That was how they saw him. And he was a happy child, always full of love and compassion for his people. It's a little like Mr. Waldo, Peter Waldo, that was the whole thrust and reason for the Waldensian Inquisition. Well, I don't know that I would call it an inquisition. An inquisition is where you go before a judge and they inquire to see if you're guilty or innocent. An inquisition, okay, may have started through the courts and through the judge, the great judge, which would have been the Pope, the papacy, but it was much more than an inquiry. It was the vengeance and the wrath upon the people of Waldo. But today, Peter Waldo, or in French it would be Pierre Valdez, depending on your language, Percival, the great hero of the Arthurian romances, the great son of Arthur at the Round Table. Yeah, all of the parables and stories are all talking about the same royal bloodlines, and each and every kingdom, whether it be Rome or Babylon or even medieval Europe, was fixated on these divine beings and what astrological signs would tell them. Hence the 12 nights at the Round Table. So the only other force in the world that was, I wouldn't say wise, but cunning. Cunning because they had a plan, we'll say. They didn't like this man because, you see, the Senate was set up so that they could make edicts and laws that would benefit them. And when their generals and their armies would go into the battlefield and conquer another kingdom to establish the Roman Empire, the Pax Romana, which had not yet been established, which would later be established by Octavian, Augustus Caesar. But you have to understand what kind of peace this would be. It's kind of like the peace that we have today in America. It was the peace that the Roman armies established to keep the peasants down and the various countries from rising. There was no more disturbance because they had ironclad power over the people, which is something that, ironically, is not peace at all. The real peace was when Julius Caesar reigned, because the people loved him. And he built them libraries, and he built them theaters, and he gave them wealth a part of the booty they shared in the gardens and the good life, and no taxes. The promises of Caesar were always kept. He loved his people. But the Senate, they wanted absolute power, and they needed the peace or the ceasing of anyone rising up against their influence or anyone challenging their authority to reign. Now, they started propaganda saying that Caesar was dictator for life. You hear this all the time. He wanted to be dictator. Well, he could have had that. The people would have given it to him. They wanted to make him king, but he refused. He finally relented and said, I will only do it for this short period of time in order to take the power of the Senate away so that you can be free. And he was going to give all the taxes back to the people and build roads and give everybody all this money. But the Senate wanted the money. They wanted the power, and they would not stand for that. So now enter the man, they say, that is the reason why we have the month of August. Well, it's interesting because his name wasn't August. His name was Octavian. And so because he gave himself the name, not by birth, but by usurpation, he declared himself the deity that ruled after Julius or July. But it was something that was an afterthought. Of course, Julius was named Julius, and the month was named after him because he was divine, because the astrologers saw his star in the sky. And we'll talk about that. But as great as a leader as Julius Caesar may have been, history does tell us that he had no heir. Well, what do you mean he had no heir? He had plenty of opportunities to have an heir. It's not like he couldn't have children. He certainly did have his son by Cleopatra the 7th, Ptolemy the 15th, whom he wished to give the kingdom to be his heir, but he was forbidden by the Senate because they knew what that meant. So it would have been quite easy for him to find a wife. He was the king of the world. Anybody would have married him, and he could have had a child. But the trouble was, he needed a divine woman for his divine nature, because it was the divine plan that the divine Messiah would be born, and he had to choose his partner wisely. It had to have been according to the dictates of the priests who knew from the stars who that woman would be. It was difficult. For his divine lineage, it required a divine wife. You will find in the annals of history all of these things that make the historical accounts crude and almost vulgar, having all of these different wives and murdering their wives and the things that they would do. You know, much of that, all of it, history, just like the Bible, is parabolic, such as Cleopatra being bitten by the serpent purposefully so that she could commit suicide. And in fact, she didn't die. Not of that snake bite. For that snake bite was the enlightenment in the temple mysteries, that she became an adept and charmed the serpent and was not able to be killed by its bite. Just as the Christians later that followed her would say, they had the power as a divine child of the living deity that even if a serpent should bite them, they would not die. You see, because they had authority over serpents. And this was an initiation in the priesthood. So even though they will tell you that Caesar was already married to a woman and had an affair with Cleopatra, you have to understand that was said only because of the laws that Rome had that would restrict a man from marrying his own true love. So they would end up marrying their nieces or their daughters out of law, but they weren't in love with them, and they rarely had sex, and if they did, it was only to bring forth an heir. They weren't really married, or that wasn't their real companion. Most of the time, they didn't want to marry that person. Well, of course, there were times when they may have done this themselves, being the corrupt player. But if the Senate did not want that person to be the heir, because that family line was sort of an antagonist, or there was a competition between certain bloodlines, they wanted the emperor to marry one of the senator's daughters or something so they could have power. Maybe a senator that got really wealthy, a billionaire, could influence the emperor marrying somebody. So they would, if they couldn't get you to love that person, they didn't care. They just wanted that person to be the heir, and they didn't want you running around with another girl. It's not that it brought shame at all. That was what Augustus Caesar was told, the propaganda that was telling the world. That, oh, Julius Caesar was shameful. There was an affair. No, it wasn't at all. Julius Caesar says, I will not marry the woman you insist upon me marrying and having a child. I'm sure that he could have had a child with the woman that they, by law, said he had to marry. But he refused. And when he chose the Cleopatra heir, which had no connection to any of the bloodlines or nieces or daughters of any senators or billionaires, and it wasn't for money at all, but it was because of the divine calling to bring forth the heir, the Messiah. And Caesar followed faithfully the divine plan, as the senators began to devise their own plan to stand against the Christ and make their own kingdom in defiance. The woman he chose wasn't really a choice either. It was a destiny. And of course, as we've said, Cleopatra was declared to be the reincarnation of Aphrodite. Afro is the word that, well, we still use it today, but it means the African people. And so Aphrodite is the daughter of Africa. And it was a destined marriage, a unification of the peoples of earth. There would always the woman of the line of Canaan, right, from Cain, and the man from the line of Seth. If you look at the lineal descendants from Seth to Noah and from Cain to Noah, you'll see that there are the same names, but a bit backwards. Because in Seth's line, Enoch is the seventh in line from Adam. But in Cain's line, he's the firstborn son of Cain. So it kind of goes backwards and a little bit mixed up and upside down, but mostly the same names, Enoch and Enosh and Jared or Irid in some, it seems almost like it's a slight variant. What it's telling you is these are the two lines of the flesh and the spirit. So why was Cain cursed? Well, we're all cursed, aren't we? Because we're under the curse of Cain, which is the mark of the beast. And it's not because Cain was evil. I know you hear the story that Cain killed his brother Abel, Ab-El, or Abi, father El, and you say, well, then he's evil, right? But remember, this is a story. It's a story about the flesh who's unaware of the spiritual and ignores the spiritual and goes and wanders like a wanderer and a fugitive in the earth, as a conscious mind seeking through the law and through government and through control and through bestial nature, the carnivore, trying to make its way. But that carnivore's physical nature is a part of us, and it will be wed to the higher spiritual conscious mind, which is El, the light body, or the higher consciousness, which in our world is no longer. Now, there is a replacement for the higher consciousness, and that is with Seth. But that is more or less not the true Abel. It is a replacement and a mortal. For his son was Enosh, which means mortal. And so it is not the spiritual line of Abel, but that spiritual line of Abel became the first stone, like a foundation for the temple in heaven, for the spiritual heavenly body, which will eventually come down out of heaven, adorned as a bride for her husband. But the replacement for the spiritual is the philosophical, and therefore today people do not understand that this woman is not the free woman, but the woman that's in bondage with her children. But it's because Cain represents the flesh, and it's going through a period of time of 7 times, and the 7 heads is Tiamat, which is time and matter. And we, in the fleshly sense, through Cain, are going through the 7 times. You see, and when that 7 times is over, the Gentiles are come in, and the wedding begins. Friends, understand that this world is going to be exalted by this wedding. And this wedding is because there must be a spiritual wedding to the literal, physical, androgynous peoples of earth. So we talked about yesterday the acta of the Pilati, or the Acts of Pilate, which describes what Jesus looked like. And when he was born at the Pax Romana. That's when this Christ was born, which is when Caesarion, Aphrodite's son, Venus's son, the great Virgin Mother's child, was born. But in that book of the Acts of Pilate, it describes Jesus as a light-skinned, blue-eyed, blonde man. But if you look into the past and you look at the ancient Madonnas, they were the Madonna and Child. The Madonna was always black because she is Aphrodite from Africa, and Isis, the great mother, Mother Earth, was a beautiful black woman. A lot of people say that Cleopatra wasn't black because she has lineage back to the Greeks on her father's side, because every one of these messiahs were born from the wedding of the two. And so when the original Cleopatra was taken from Africa and brought up to the original Ptolemy, she was indeed a black woman, and her children were black, or shall we say, combined with these two lineages. And the Messiah then would be a Joseph who had the coat of many colors. So Solomon married Bathsheba, a Canaanite, and it's very clear in the book of Solomon, the Song of Solomon, that she was a black woman. So the grand wedding, and these two are equal, the male and the female. The Rex Sacrorum is a male and a female, and they shared their power and their rule. And indeed, Caesar shared his power with Cleopatra, and she was as powerful politically And financially, she financed many of the wars going on at that time, which weren't vengeful wars, but wars to protect the people from the hordes of the barbarians coming down from the north. What you hear about the wickedness and the very vulgar character and disposition of individuals like Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar, or King David, who was supposed to have raped Bathsheba and then murdered her husband. That wasn't true. That's not what happened. Like Zeus, who looked down from his heavenly seat and saw Rhea sunbathing, and he's supposed to have raped her. Well, this isn't what this is talking about. These are the fertility rites, ceremonies. They didn't happen literally. King David and Caesar would do things in the temple to represent the nature that we lived in, which had both a physical and a fleshly nature that was beautiful and divinely inspired in the fertility rites. Julius Caesar found his companion in Cleopatra VII, the true incarnation of Isis, a true divine goddess with whom he was destined to have a child with. But the Senate, being an evil body who wanted power, made laws to stop him from being with this woman. In fact, the entire war was centered around Caesar marrying that particular woman. They hated her. Why? Because she was the divine Isis, and they knew that their child would be the divine Christ. And so the Senate got together. They instigated Brutus and the others to murder and conspire to murder and to set up their own person in place and name him after the fact Augustus Caesar and declare he was in the will. Well, this will that was supposedly saying that Julius Caesar wanted Augustus Caesar to be the heir was drawn up on the fly, supposedly the day he died or something, or that week while they were trying to kill him. Well, of course, it wasn't his will at all. We'll show beyond a doubt that Julius Caesar wanted to declare his son with Cleopatra Caesarion the heir. But he could not, because they refused to let him marry Cleopatra and to have an official wedding, and therefore the child was illegitimate, as it says much like there in Matthew and Mark and Luke, where it talks about the birth of Christ and his father that was illegitimately his father. And by the way, yesterday I said that if you go to the book of Luke, and I misspoke, I should have said Matthew, but if you go to the book of Luke, Jesus' father, Joseph's father, was Heli. But if you go to the book of Matthew, Joseph's father is Jacob, which they sometimes translate James, but it's literally Jacob. And that is James or Jacob that was the Jacob or James the righteous, the just, that was the Zadokite priest reigning over the real Jerusalem at Heliopolis, as we said. Well, who really is this Jacob, for whom heaven and earth came into being? Well, it actually tells you in Luke. In the book of Luke, chapter 3, it gives the genealogy of Jesus, Joseph, and his father was, it says in our Heli. Well, the H is just added, like the J on Jesus or John. It's Eli, or L-I. I is syntax for my. And so it really reads my L. And indeed, this man Jacob is L. Just a side note. And this idea of being born of a virgin meant nothing else but that Cleopatra was the Virgin Isis, Aphrodite, and Venus, and was declared to be so. There were statues that were set up by Caesar himself, Julius, because Julius Caesar was saying he was the emperor for life. Some called him a dictator. He didn't want to be a dictator, but he had to have the power to destroy the Senate, to give them back freedom, to bring in the kingdom. And the kingdom would be in that child that was born, according to the story that was written in the stars. According to destiny, that was destiny's child. And the Senate knew it. So they made up the will that Augustus Caesar would take over. They made it up to deny the child, Caesarian little Caesar, or Ptolemy the 15th, the throne. And they indeed murdered Julius Caesar, and Cleopatra fled to Egypt with the child. And then there at Egypt, where Caesar had previously made this grand temple and set up statues that said on the statue, this is Isis, this is Venus, and this is Cleopatra, the incarnation of them. It was there at the temple of Hathor, the great Virgin Mother. Also, next to it, dedicated temple to Isis. And next to that, of course, a temple to Cleopatra. This grand holy site was just about maybe a few miles from a site that today people have heard, maybe because you went to Las Vegas and they tried to imitate it, Luxor, right? So that was the temple of Dendera. Then down a little further south was the temple of Luxor, the temple of man. And this is where Solomon built the temple that we call the Temple of Solomon. And this is in an area on the bend of the River Nile south of Abydos. So Julius Caesar, the emperor of Rome, he was murdered March of 44. That's why we call the Ides of March. His eventual successor, it took a while, was Octavian, who took the name of Caesar, knowing that Caesar was a divine being, was established, knowing that he was the rightful heir to Osiris. And if Caesar wouldn't marry the right woman and have an heir of the right lineage in the Senate so they could all divvy up the money, then they would just kill Julius. And if Julius had a son, well, we'll just make it illegal for the child to become the heir. And in fact, in the end, they just crucified him because he didn't want a material kingdom. The destiny that the stars were speaking of had nothing to do with this material kingdom and this filthy throne. His kingdom was no part of this world. And so his people who loved him with all of their heart and gave their lives for him, they fought for him. They wept for him. They adored him. And Cleopatra. And Christianity swept the world. It was the one who was to come. John the Baptist proclaimed that he was the one to go and follow him. And the world did. The entire world. Now, in fact, they did not follow Augustus. Augustus was beat out by Jesus Christ as the one that the entire nation, in fact, the world, would worship and would believe in. And so eventually, after 300 or 400 years, the evil side found a way to usurp Christ's authority and love by infiltrating the very church that Christ made and making it a Roman church, the Holy Roman Empire. But they murdered the lineal descendants of Jesus, as we've talked about there in the Languedoc, and inserted a lineal descendant of Judean Jeconiah of the line of Perez and put him on the throne as the papacy. So Julius Caesar was assassinated, but it exposed the fact that the empire didn't really have a plan of succession, not from Julius. I mean, if it was just according to Julius's plan, he wanted to marry Cleopatra. If it was the plan of the priesthood, of the stars, because remember, the priesthood was in Egypt, and they were advising Cleopatra, and Caesar was there with Cleopatra. And this is where they learned, or Caesar learned, that the Roman calendar was wrong, was a lunar calendar. The Egyptians had figured out that there were 365 days in a year and 1/4. And that it was necessary to have a clear calendar. So the calendar that was born at the birth of their son Caesarion, who was called Isa, the child of Isis. Isa also was the spiritual child that had the birthright that Jacob stole from, if you'll remember back in the book of Genesis, where Jacob and Esau tried to figure out who was going to have the birthright. It's the spirit and the flesh. They both have the birthright. But they've got to come together in unity. And though Jacob beat out his spiritual brother, Esau, in the short run, in the long run, his blessing that he would eventually overcome his brother. But the spirit would then make a friendship. And through their wives, they would wed. And the heavenly kingdom would finally be recognized. So at the first, there was a contentious, in the history books, they call it the triumvirate. They couldn't decide who would reign, because even though legally Augustus Caesar was in this will, was supposed to be the heir, but it wasn't recognized officially because Cleopatra was still alive, and she was telling the world, and so was Mark Antony, this is what the war was about, that we have Caesar's son. The will is fake. So what they had to do was divide the kingdom up into 3 different parts. There was the triumvirate of Augustus, Cleopatra, and Mark Antony. So it was kind of like somehow or another, one of us is going to be standing last on this hill. Would it be the descendants of Christ, or would it be this evil takeover by the Senate? The one who emerged, of course, as the sole imperial ruler was this Octavian. He was the future Caesar, Augustus. He went about to consolidate his claim and to beat out Mark Antony and Cleopatra by a propaganda phase in the country. He would make statues of himself and pretend that, Caesar had an affair and it was immoral, and the people were listening to this. However, the people loved him, and it was very difficult for him, and this is why he couldn't just usurp power, even with the will. But he was politically savvy. He knew that his claim to the throne needed the support of the public, and it needed support of the people almost more than it needed the Roman legions. So he decided to strengthen his public image by having a public relations effort. So after a few months of the assassination of Caesar, he began to commemorate Julius Caesar, and he would host these games, these great big theatrical games for the people in his name. He would entertain the people. It was like public relations, as we said. Now, he knew that there was a lot to be gained by hosting all these events in Julius Caesar's name, because he wanted the people to believe he was the true heir. He couldn't deny. The people would never accept that Julius Caesar was not the heir. And whoever Julius Caesar says was the next one to take over the kingdom, that's what they wanted. So the only way he could defeat Julius Caesar was to deceive the world into thinking Julius Caesar chose him. And that's why they made up this phony will. Well, during the games, there was one day a comet. It hung in the sky over Rome. It was said that the comet was Caesar's soul ascending into the deities. So Augustus said, well, that star that carried Caesar's soul back to the heavenly realm was the legacy of his heir, which was Augustus. Because he couldn't deny it had already been recorded by China and the Koreans and different countries around the world, that a star had been seen that would announce the birth of the Messiah. This happened right around 45 BC when Caesarion was born. So what he did, he couldn't deny these things, and people knew it, is when this other comet went through, that everyone said, and the priesthood said, was Julius Caesar's soul ascending back into the heavens as a divine being. And the other star that the wise men followed was the birth of the one who was the heir, and this was the Christ, born of the Virgin. So what Augustus Caesar had to do is legally deny that child from being the Messiah. At the same time, he had to make people believe that it was an illegitimate child, that maybe it wasn't even the child of Cleopatra, and maybe it wasn't even Caesar's child. Perhaps Cleopatra was a whore, you see. And they disparaged this notion and then quickly eradicated the concept until it was rewritten in the Gospels in the way and form that we have it today. So when this other star fell, it was this big event. And Julius Caesar was still alive, of course, because he had just given birth to his son. But, of course, this is the reason why Julius Caesar knew that he had to protect this child, and Cleopatra knew this, and they sent him to India. But before he died, he spent much of his time down there with Cleopatra in Egypt. And he learned from her and the priesthood there at Dendera and Heliopolis, from the great priest Sosigenes, that the true calendar had 365 days and 1/4. And so he learned that the new age had begun with the birth of that child, and that they would start the new calendar at his birth. Now, I said the other day that they did it in 46. Well, it didn't become official until the year 45, I believe. It's hard to get the exact dates on all of this, but right around the 46, but I think 45 BC was when the calendar started. And this, of course, was probably the exact date that this child was born and the star was seen. And so the calendar already existed. It was the Egyptian calendar of the Sosigenes, the great priest, high priest over the temple there, where the Virgin Cleopatra reigned. So the Roman Senate recognized Julius Caesar's apotheosis, they called it, setting the stage for the imperial crown to be given these divine rights. See, they understood that Julius Caesar was the Osiris, or divinely appointed emperor. And to have those divine rights was something that they needed. So they deceived the people into thinking, or at least, I don't think they deceived the people at that time, but over the years, through manipulation, the world today, if they're going to go to college, they're going to learn about these things. They're going to learn how great Julius Caesar was, because everybody knows he was the divine being. If you don't have a great divine being to run the kingdom, then it's not going to be whatever you succeed in that kingdom. Then when you become the king, you are taking on that mantle. They wanted that. So Augustus Caesar and the Senate devised a plan where they would tell everybody that yes, we know that you love Julius Caesar and he was divine, and the astrological signs prove it. But the day that the star rose was the day that Caesarion was born. But he hid that fact from the world today. In those days, many people knew it. And this is why it was very difficult at the beginning. Augustus had to be very harsh, and he would behead people, and he would murder all these different ones to continue to keep that power. And they literally made, it was like almost forbidden to talk about Jesus. And this is why we have the Gospels, because this is the only way we could ever get the Gospel, is if some of the people were sort of, their names were changed. We'll make a little parable of it. We won't mention Julius Caesar's son in the book, but we'll use words like Lazarus, Laosaurus, which is La Caesar. Well, it was a very wise way to write the gospel so that the wise men would not be able to understand, but the babes would receive the love of Jesus, and the kingdom of Christ would be born. And friends, what I'm trying to tell you is that there's a much greater reason the Bible came down to us in this parable form. There's a reason that the world hates Jesus. Just read chapter 1 of Psalms, and chapter 2. Let us break their bands asunder, the Bible says, that the kings of the earth will say. But our Heavenly Father will say, I have installed my king upon my holy mountain. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry, and ye perish in the way. So, the plan that's been going along, if you look at it, you'll find it every time. It's to keep you away from the truth. The Catholic Church itself banned Christianity and then went and murdered all of the Christians all over the world and stamped it out, and purposefully went to Baghdad and got a Jewish lineage that was put into the medieval European lineages, the Merovingian line and others, through his bringing over this lineage of Jeconiah and forming the papacy. While believing, once again, that they were stamping out Christianity by murdering people. And in actuality, it was never about an actual king on earth. You know, Theos truly designed this child by destiny. It had nothing to do with human beings. Julius Caesar and Cleopatra were human beings, but their divine son that was born, which would be the king, didn't even have an actual throne on earth. But the mysteries were fulfilled in his death. And now the Christ in us will reign. His kingdom was established according to the prophecy, but not in Augustus Caesar, nor in the Roman Empire, nor in the Nicene Creed, nor in Jehovah's Witnesses, nor in modern Mormons, nor is it in any other Protestant church, Luther, Calvin, or Wycliffe, but in the Spirit that is within us, that will be the authority, and it will move upon the world, and it will shine bright like a light. And that light will not be hid in a bushel nor under a table, but it will be put upon the table on a candlestick with 7 branches. And those 7 branches are the chakras. And so at Pentecost, they got their crown chakra lit. It's interesting. Someone told me, a friend of mine, we were talking a couple of days ago, that crown chakra is supposed to be like a purple or violet color. It's when it's lit, it's enlightenment, it's truth. We were talking about how today there seems to be an infatuation in the occult and the world, or the powers that be, with this purple. We talk about the purple pill, the purple rain, right? It's a lot of things that they're talking about. What the transgender movement or something, or the rainbow. It's the last color of the rainbow, the violet. And so it holds a great deal of meaning because it is the final flame of enlightenment. Remember the torch? That's the torch of the Olympians. Who are they? They battled the Titans. Friends, Zeus led the Olympians to battle against Satan and all his demons. But we're going to learn all of this divine truth soon. We're going to learn from our mother, who will be here, all about nature and the herbs. Friends, I tell you, if you were to eat what is natural, I just ate some of these acorns here on my property, and I've been so inspired. I'm going to roast them, and I'm going to just probably live almost exclusively on these nuts and berries that I have on my property that grow wild, and forget the agriculture, because they are so good. It's like, I think maybe acorns are, so I don't know how the world could have been deceived. I don't know how we could have known. We're told, oh, they're poison, they're bitter, they're no good. Peanuts are bitter when they're raw. These acorns aren't really any different than peanuts. They could use a little salt and a little roasting, but they taste really good. They're very sweet, the ones that I have. Now, there are other kinds of acorns and stuff that are much more bitter, that have a lot of tannins, and all you do is pick them, put them in buckets, and fill it with water and leave it sit for a few days, and then pour the water off, and then you roast them and salt them, and they're huge, big, fleshy meat that is so delicious and healthy for you, because they have 60-70% oil that our body needs to get energy from, not the sugars that they're giving us. Sugar, if you don't have the right oils, if you're not eating oil in your diet, then you'll die at some point without that energy. So you can substitute it with sugar if you don't have the oil. Sometimes you have to. It healed my arm because I wasn't getting the right oil. So now I've discovered all the source of this food here in the acorn. I have them by the pounds and pounds and pounds and pounds of them here. And all I got to do is roast and salt them. So truly, this world is a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful paradise that we're going to realize very soon. And yes, Jesus himself will return, and every eye will see him, every tongue will confess, and every knee shall bend, because Blessed is he that comes in the name of the Lord. Amen. I'm going to go ahead and go. I really hope you guys have a wonderful evening. This is only 2 in the series. We'll do more. Got lots to tell you. I love you all. May the Lord bless you. And we'll see you tomorrow. Have a good one.